Okay, let's talk about the Battle of Dunkirk. Now, this is one of those moments in World War II that everyone's heard of, but maybe not for the reason you'd expect. See, this isn't a story about some glorious victory. No, this is a story about a miraculous escape. A story of snatching an entire army from the jaws of complete and utter annihilation. But here's where it gets really weird. You've got to ask yourself, how did this happen? How does an entire army, totally surrounded, just escape? And maybe the biggest question of all, why did their enemy, an enemy at the absolute peak of its power, just stop? We're going to dig into one of the most consequential and mysterious pauses in all of history. So, to really get why this was such a miracle, you first have to understand just how catastrophic the situation was. We're talking May 1940, and for the Allied forces in Europe, it was looking like the end of the line. Total annihilation was on the table. I mean, the speed of the German blitzkrieg was just staggering. Think about this timeline. On May 10th, the invasion kicks off and Churchill becomes prime minister. Just 4 days later, Rotterdam is bombed to pieces and the Dutch army surrenders. By May 20th, we're talking only 10 days in, German panzers have already reached the English Channel, slicing the Allied armies in two. And a day later, the British Expeditionary Force is completely trapped with their backs literally against the sea at Dunkirk. You know, the situation was so grim, so hopeless, that the Germans actually started dropping propaganda leaflets from the sky. Imagine being a soldier on the ground, and one of these flutters down. Your troops are entirely surrounded. Stop fighting, put down your arms. I mean, for those guys on the beach, that must have felt like the absolute truth. The war for them had to feel like it was already over. But then, just when all hope seemed lost, something completely unexpected happened. Right at the peak of Germany's triumph, a pretty desperate British counterattack near a town called Arras managed to plant a tiny but critical seed of doubt in the minds of the German command. And this is where that classic fog of war really takes over. The legendary general, Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, he gets on the radio and reports his division is being hit by hundreds of tanks. But, get this, the reality? The Allies only had 74 tanks in that entire attack. And only 16 of them were the big, heavily armored kind. It was a pretty small force, but man, did it create a huge psychological shock. So what happens next? Well, this completely misplaced fear starts to ripple its way up the chain of command. Suddenly, the German generals, who'd been so confident and aggressive, they start to get nervous. They're thinking, wait a minute, did we move too fast? Are we overextended? And that fear, a fear born from what was basically a bluff, is what led directly to the single most famous and, controversial order of the entire battle. The Halt order, for 3 critical days. The German panzers, this supposedly unstoppable armored spearhead, were ordered to just stop, miles from Dunkirk. Now, 3 days might not sound like a lot, right? But in the middle of a lightning-fast blitzkrieg, it was an absolute eternity. It was the impossible, unbelievable window of opportunity that the Allies so desperately needed. And that, of course, brings us to the central mystery of this whole story. Why? Why on earth was the Halt order given? Historians have been arguing about this for decades, and really, the answer seems to boil down to 4 main competing theories. All right, let's break down the possibilities, one by one. Theory number 1, the terrain. German command was genuinely worried that the marshy, wet ground around Dunkirk was just terrible for their expensive tanks. They didn't want them getting bogged down. Theory 2, the massive ego of Hermann Göring, the head of the Luftwaffe. He insisted his air force could finish the job all by themselves from the sky. Theory 3 is a bit more practical. The panzer divisions had moved so incredibly fast that they'd actually outrun their own infantry support. They needed to stop, regroup, and let the foot soldiers catch up. And then there's theory number 4, the most controversial of them all, the idea that Hitler intentionally let the British escape to give them a, quote, sporting chance. Yeah, believe it or not, this whole sporting chance idea actually comes partly from Hitler himself. Way later, in 1945, he apparently claimed that Churchill was, quote, quite unable to appreciate the sporting spirit. The implication being that he deliberately let the British army go, maybe as some kind of grand gesture, maybe hoping it would lead to a peace deal with Britain. Okay, but here's where the story gets really complicated and where that theory starts to fall apart. You look at the actual order issued at the time, Directive Number 13, and what does it say? It calls for the complete annihilation of the French, English, and Belgian forces in the pocket of Dunkirk. Complete annihilation. Now that doesn't exactly sound like a sporting chance, does it? And it's this total contradiction that's at the very heart of why historians still argue about this today. But you know what? Regardless of the reason for the halt, the consequence of that 3-day pause is something no one disputes. It absolutely fundamentally changed the entire course of the Second World War. I mean, that 3-day breather gave the Allies just enough time to scramble and set up some new defensive lines. It let the Royal Air Force, which had been taking a beating, regroup and start providing crucial air cover over the beaches. And you can't forget this part, a truly heroic defense by French forces at the city of Lille tied up 7 whole German divisions, keeping them away from Dunkirk. All of these pieces coming together made the impossible possible. Operation Dynamo, the Great Evacuation, could finally begin. And the result? The escape of over 330,000 soldiers. This wasn't just a bunch of troops. This was the experienced, professional core of the entire British Army. Getting them home meant Britain could continue the fight. Simple as that. Without those men, it's almost certain the UK would have been forced to sue for peace. The world we live in today would look completely and terrifyingly different. So, what was it in the end? A disastrous military blunder born out of a moment of panic and a clash of egos? Or was it some kind of calculated political move that just backfired spectacularly? The honest truth is, we'll probably never know for sure. But what we do know is that the halt at Dunkirk is one of history's greatest what-ifs, a simple pause that ended up saving an army, preserving a nation, and literally changing the world.